Hello and welcome to another History and Myths video by RanGB. Today we are going to cover a topic that still today a lot of people wonder about, and that's Pearl Harbor. Now, to do a proper video about Pearl Harbor, I would need probably a 3-hour video to speak about all the reasons why it actually happened. Pearl Harbor was nothing but the end of the road of a very long series of things that happened since the 19th century up to 1941. Now, there's no easy way to explain all those factors and all those things in a short video, and I want to keep this relatively short. So we are going to try to explain exactly what happened at Pearl Harbor, and not so much about the whys. I mean, the whys are very important, really important to understand what happened there and why did it happen. But really, I can't make a video within a reasonable time explaining all the things that happened because they are all interconnected. You can't explain one thing without explaining why that thing happened, because there was this other thing that happened that influenced the first, but at the same time there was a third thing that happened that was influenced by the first two. So it's impossible to cover the road to Pearl Harbor. It's impossible. You can't, unless you make a video which would cover easily 2-3 hours, and I'm not going to do that, at least not now. At any rate, what happened in Pearl Harbor is really, and I guess everyone knows, but I'm going to explain it, is that the Imperial Japanese Navy staged a surprise attack on the American Pacific Navy to destroy it and, well, keep the US away from the big scale invasions that were to be launched in the Far East. Japan, what they wanted was to conquer the natural resource areas of Indonesia, Borneo, Malaysia, essentially all the Pacific Ring and the northern part of Oceania. And they wanted that because they had no natural resources in their own nation. So they wanted easy and cheap access to resources. Now, of course, they knew that to do that, they had to beat the USA. It was inevitable because the US had possessions in the middle of the zone they were planning to expand into, the Philippines. And so it was inevitable that a war was going to happen, and that the US would oppose Japan, because up to then the US had been opposing Japan in everything they did. So Pearl Harbor was, in a sense, a way to delay the US answer until a time where Japan was so strong defensively that they couldn't be beaten, and the US had to accept and concede Japan the wins and the invasions they had done, so they became legal. Let's put it that way. Of course, the US was having none of that, but that's a totally different thing. Pearl Harbor happened 7th of December 1941. At that date, 6 Japanese fleet carriers, the strongest part of the Japanese combined fleet, was to stage an attack on the American main base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The objective was to put out the facilities of the port, and to destroy as many ships as possible to prevent them later on to attack the Japanese landing and invasions in the Far East. In that sense, it was really successful, but we'll see later on that in other senses it wasn't that successful. The first attack began at 7:48 a.m. Local time, and comprised 183 planes coming from the 6 carriers of the Japanese fleet. The intended target of the first wave was mainly the Pacific Fleet itself. Torpedo bombers with modified torpedoes to run at very shallow depths to not collide with the bottom of the Sound of Pearl Harbor, were directed towards the main naval base and attacked Battersea Row. Meanwhile, fighters and dive bombers would attack Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, the two main U.S. Army Air Forces fighter bases of the island. The attack took the Americans totally by surprise. Actually, it was detected. It was detected beforehand, and while they were still away, the Americans could have reacted if they knew where it was coming, but they didn't. It was detected by a radar seated in very close to Pearl Harbor. But at that same, I mean, the radar was very new on technology at the time, and the technicians attending it were really trained into it. When they detected there were planes coming, they thought it was a flight of B-17s that were coming from the mainland to reinforce the air bases on near Pearl Harbor. So they dismissed the contacts as nothing else but the B-17s. Of course, it was a very different history. The attack on the airbase was crippling to the defending force there. They took a heavy toll on planes because they were all parked in the same area. Instead of dispersion, which is the standard thing to do when you are expecting an attack, they were all stored together and parked in the same areas. The US was on alert back then. The negotiations with the Japanese weren't going really well, but they decided, and they weren't expecting Pearl Harbor, obviously. So instead of doing what you do when you are under risk of an air attack, which is dispersing your parking areas and putting planes wide apart from each other, well, they put it all together to better defend them from possible sabotages. Of course, what came was the air attack, and the parking methodology, helped the Japanese quite a little bit. In the meantime, the main attack on the Pearl Harbor base, caught everyone by total surprise. In fact, at the beginning, people even thought they were American planes doing an exercise, but soon they were taken out of the harbor by all the explosions and things going on. There was very little opposition. There were almost no American planes trying to defend the position. The AA guns weren't ready, so the Japanese got away with it. Now, the second wave was a little bit different in that sense because when the second wave came, of course, everyone was already on high alert and they were going to shoot as soon as an enemy plane was seen. The second wave of the attack consisted in 171 planes, and it was tasked with further attacking air bases in the island and doing a second follow-up attack on Pearl Harbor proper. The results were really strong, but the Japanese this time around took heavier casualties. All in all, I'm trying to make this simple because speaking about the whole battle would be too long. But all in all, the losses were pretty bad. To begin with, the life loss was heavy. 2,403 people lost their lives during the attacks. Between them, 68 civilians killed. The number of injured personnel was, massive. As for material losses, they were very, very bad as well. A total of 19 US Navy ships were destroyed or damaged. Between them, the 7 battleships of the US Pacific Fleet. 4 of them were straight sunk. 2 of them were beyond any repair possible. 2 of them were actually refloated and rejoined the fleet, but it was 3 years before that happened. 3 further battleships were damaged from light to moderate conditions and were able to rejoin the fleet by 1942. 3 cruisers were damaged, 2 of them very badly damaged, and 1 of them lightly damaged. 4 destroyers were sunk or destroyed. 2 of them were were destroyed, were blown up, but they were rebuilt and rejoined the fleet in 1943, 1944. 2 of them were damaged and rejoined the fleet in 1942. 1 mine layer was destroyed, and several other auxiliaries were also damaged or sunk. The most important of them was the USS Utah, which was a battleship, a former battleship actually, had been rebuilt as a target ship, was no longer a combat unit, but the Japanese thought it was an actual battleship, so a lot of torpedo bombers went for it, saving probably more damage to the real battleships. Let's put it that way. As for air losses, the US Navy lost a total of 92 planes, with a further 31 damaged, and the US Army Air Force lost 77 planes, sorry, and 128. The loss was staggering, and it could have been much, much, much worse because this was life loss and material lost. But thankfully for the US side, well, the Japanese didn't attack the installations of the port proper. There was in the plan, the Japanese plan contemplated a third attack that would have the main objective: the installations, the fuel storage area, the repair shops, the dry docks, to kick the naval base out of action for months, if not years. That never happened. The third wave never happened because Japanese actually were thinking that the attack was very high risk and they weren't going to be able to pull it. So they were very nervous when the second wave attacked, and there was a higher response to that because the Americans were waiting for it. Well, the Japanese Admiral Nagumo, got really nervous and called off the third strike and retired the fleet. So it could have been much, much, much worse than what it was. Of course, the attack itself, military, was a huge success. I mean, it was the longest range strike ever in history up to that point. It was a logistical miracle from the Japanese standpoint. We will speak a bit about that later on. And actually caused very strong losses to the American fleet. I mean, the US Pacific Fleet virtually ceased to exist because the battleships were out of the equation for at the very least 3 of them were out of the equation for months. The rest of them were out of the war for good. So in that sense, militarily was really a success. But it was a catastrophe for the Japanese because they totally miscalculated the US answers to that. Of course, we all know by now that if you really mess with the Americans, they strike back with a vengeance and they don't let you go until you are totally crushed. Back then, the Japanese thought the US was weak, and that if they forced them out for the war for a while, well, they would just take it and not hit back. We know better by now, but the Japanese did a whole massive mistake, thinking that such an attack would cause anything that other than the US striking back. So while the attack itself was a military success, it was, strategically speaking, a mistake of such proportions that is really hard to understand even today. I think Admiral Halsey, actually made a prophecy when he got back to Pearl Harbor later on that day aboard the Enterprise, and they could see all the fires raging, all the devastation caused. Before we are through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell. And I think the Americans lived up to that promise. Now, onto the myths. Of course, the most obvious myth of Pearl Harbor. So many people have spoken about that. There are so many theories about Pearl Harbor. Is that Roosevelt knew, and that the Americans knew, and that they let it happen. Now, I'm naming this as a myth. That means it's not true, and actually it's not true, and this is very easy to dislodge if you take the different arguments of the conspiracionists about Pearl Harbor and destroy them one by one. The first reason why this myth is false is, well, the conspirationists say that this was intended by Roosevelt so the American people would want to become involved in the war. Now, there's one thing that is clear, and that's true, and this: if you attack America, America is going to strike back. So, in that sense, it's true. Yeah, well, letting someone attack Pearl Harbor is going to allow the president to declare war in the attacker. However, the attacker was Japan, not Germany, and Roosevelt wanted a war, but against Germany, not Japan. Yeah, it's true, Japan was allied with Germany, or not. Now, one of the things that very few people know, or at least recognize or acknowledge, is that the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo Axis Pact was a defensive one. It's clearly stated in the treaty that if one of the signatories is attacked by a third country, the other two will come and assist the attacked nation. In other words, it's a defensive pact, it's a defensive alliance. And that's the reason why Italy didn't go into the war the second Germany attacked Poland. Because Germany attacked Poland. It was a war of aggression. No one attacked Germany. Germany was the one attacking. Later on, Italy joined, but that was a totally different thing. It had nothing to do with it. It was with the fact that Italy wanted the spoils of France. It's also why later on, when Germany invaded the USSR, Japan didn't declare war on the USSR, didn't it? Why? Because they weren't forced to. The treaty is specifically a defensive agreement, not an alliance where you can attack another country and the other two are going to back you up. No. So, for those who say that Roosevelt wanted a war, again, yeah, true, he wanted it, versus Germany, not against Japan, and there was absolutely nothing that guaranteed that if Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen, Hitler would be so massively stupid as to declare war on the United States. He actually did, but that's out of the question. He did it 1 month later. No one, no one would expect Hitler to do something that stupid. That he did is a totally different thing. So, argument. Roosevelt wanted Pearl Harbor to happen so he could get into a war. Answer. Roosevelt wanted a war versus Germany, not against Japan. And allowing Pearl Harbor to happen actually made a war versus Germany more difficult. Because think of it. If you are in a war versus Japan in the Pacific and a war that is going really, really bad, because at the beginning it was a disaster, how are you going to justify getting into a war versus Germany as well if Germany doesn't declare on you? See, it's not even an argument, yet people use it as an argument. More arguments. A very little factor that some people mention about Pearl Harbor is not very known, but I think it's fun to remember it, and I'm going to include this into this video because I think it's a neat thing to know, is that the US Navy retired the anti-torpedo nets from Pearl Harbor shortly before the attack actually happened. And of course, conspirationists see in that move that the US Navy expected the attack and wanted it to be successful, right? Well, there are several answers to that. The first one is that Pearl Harbor back then was considered to be too shallow for a torpedo attack. When a plane drops a torpedo, or dropped a torpedo back then, well, it sank several meters before stabilizing it and coming up to a running depth and go on to hit the target. Well, the sound of Pearl Harbor was considered too shallow for torpedoes to actually go on without hitting the bottom. And that was actually correct. The Japanese torpedoes couldn't run in Pearl Harbor. Now you're going to be thinking, well, then what were those things that the torpedo bombers were carrying during the torpedo runs in Pearl Harbor? Well, they were torpedoes, but they had wooden fins. The Japanese knew about that as well, and they also knew that Pearl Harbor was essentially torpedo-proof. So they came up with an invention of their own. They added fins to the torpedoes so they wouldn't sink so low when they hit the water. And so the torpedoes, the air-launched torpedoes, were actually effective. But that wasn't expected at the time. Also, there was a second consideration, and that was that the standard procedure in case of any kind of attack in Pearl Harbor, not only air attack, also submarine attack or whatever, was to try to sortie the fleet and to put it into the ocean as soon as possible. And the torpedo nets slowed down the procession, the execution quite a while, because as the ships were trying to sail out of the port, the nettings had to be removed, and well, it was a mess. So that were the reasons why they were removed. They were considered unnecessary because they didn't expect any torpedo to be effective in Pearl Harbor anyway, and they were in the way of the fleet should the need come up for the fleet to sorry and to go out in a hurry. So yes, I think this myth doesn't resist any kind of close examination. So let's move on to the next one. The next one, however, is quite important. The next one is not meaningless at all. And it has to do with the fact that the US had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes before the Pearl Harbor attack. Actually, months before. So they actually had they were able to read the Japanese diplomatic correspondence. Now, this is of course key because it means that the US were able to read everything the Japanese government was sending to the Japanese ambassador in the United States, including the declaration of war message that was sent and intended to be delivered half an hour before the actual attack happened. It wasn't delivered half an hour before the attack happened because of, well, a mess by the Japanese embassy. But essentially, the argument is this: the U.S. was able to read the Japan's declaration of war before even the Japanese ambassador could. So why wasn't Pearl Harbor warned? Well, you know what? It's because it wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't even a break of relationship. It was, if you read the document carefully, it didn't say anywhere that they are going into war, we are declaring war, we are breaking relations with you. No. It was actually a list of reasons for Japan to be unhappy with the United States. Now, the strongest part of that particular message, and I'm going to quote it, by the way, you can read it by yourself, I'm going to link it down in the description. As I said, the strongest part of this message is the last paragraph. The rest are a list of reasons why Japan is very happy with the Americans and British. But the last paragraph is the one that is the conclusion, isn't it? Well, I'm going to read it. I'm going to quote it. And it says, open quote, "The Japanese government regrets to have to notify hereby the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government, it cannot but consider that it is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations." End quote. That's the Japanese message. Doesn't say we are going to war versus you. Doesn't say um, it doesn't even say we are breaking negotiation with relationship with you. It just says that the negotiations are over, nothing else. And this is what the Purple Code breach could give the Americans the day before. This was the message the Japanese embassy received and the Americans could read. Well, Pearl Harbor is obviously not mentioned everywhere, anywhere, and it's not even a declaration of war. Of course, it means that something is really wrong and that things are going to go really downhill from there, but it's not a formal declaration of war. There was no formal declaration of war of Japan on the United States. Actually, it was the United States which declared war to Japan. The famous Roosevelt speech, Day of Infamy, where he declares war on Japan. There's no need to declare war on another nation when the other nation has declared on you. It's totally, I mean, it's easy to see. So, no, this myth is totally false as well. Next on to the next one. Now, going on with the crypto-analyst approach to Pearl Harbor, there are some arguments that say that the Americans had breached the Japanese naval codes, which is, of course, a lot more important than breaching the diplomatic codes. Because with the naval codes, you can read the operational orders given to the Japanese Navy. Again, that's not true. The Americans didn't breach the Japanese naval codes until much later. Actually, the first message the Americans could fully decode was the one that identified Midway as the objective for the next Japanese attack, which of course led up to the Midway invasion, Midway battle, and to the big U.S. victory. Before that, for months before that, the US were only to partially decode some, very few, of the Japanese documents. Now, the problem with this is that those conspirationists who say, no, the Americans have breached the codes of the Japan Navy is, well, because in the US archives there actually are a big, big amount of Japanese messages dated from the Pearl Harbor era, which were actually decoded by the US. Now you will be thinking, okay, did they decode them or not? The answer is yes, the US actually did decode those messages in 1943. That's 2 years later, I'm afraid, to prevent an attack on Pearl Harbor. Why did they decode them in 1943? Well, it's standard. Once you have broken an enemy cipher, you try to extract as much information as you can, and that goes back, and essentially they backtracked every message they had ever intercepted from the Japanese, and they decoded them, and once decoded they stored them. And yeah, the Americans did decode those messages, but again in 1943, so I think it's a little bit late to prevent anything going on over Pearl Harbor. The first big breach of Americans on the Japanese naval coast didn't happen until June 1942, and that's 7 months later. 7 months after Pearl Harbor. Before that, no. Next myth. Americans themselves prove that Pearl Harbor is susceptible to an attack. They did. There were several war games conducted by the US Navy during the 20s and 30s, and in a couple of those, Pearl Harbor was actually a target for the war game. And in both occasions, the attack was totally surprise. They didn't expect it. They didn't see it coming. And it was just yet to be very successful. The attack itself, in the context of the war game, of course. Now, while this is true, I mean, the vulnerability of Pearl Harbor as a possible target, first you have to remember one thing. Pearl Harbor at that time wasn't the US Pacific Fleet main base. That was San Diego in California. When the Pacific Fleet was moved from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, there were several steps taken to increase the security of the main base. Also, it's to be remembered again that the mentality at the time was that no torpedo attack could happen within Pearl Harbor waters because of the very shallow nature of the port. So if no torpedoes can be used, we are safe from an attack, right? And finally, I think the most overlooked thing, because today, I mean, it doesn't seem that hard, right? Japan just sends the fleet down to the middle of the Pacific and launches a strike. It's very straightforward, right? Well, we have to remember several things. The first one is that this was the longest ever attack in history, and by a wide margin. It involved sailing a whole full fleet of aircraft carriers, cruisers, battleships, destroyers, resupplying units, oilers, etc., which had to sail from their ports at Japan up to the middle of the Pacific without breaching radio contact at all. It was in their operational orders. Under no circumstance the Japanese ships were able and allowed to use radio communication. Now you will think that, well, so what? Well, the first thing is that that fleet had to refuel. There were stated refueling points that had to be arrived at a certain moment, so Japanese oilers could refuel and top up the tanks of the Japanese fleet. But there was no radio use, and while you can command a ship that is close to you by using flags or lights, you can't command a tanker you can't see to come to you. Back then there were no GPS navigation tools. There was no way that if a ship broke formation and somehow become lost, could regain contact. It was the Pacific in December, and the Pacific in December isn't exactly the calmest place in Earth. Actually, the Japanese fleet sailed through several storms during their trip. The mere fact that the Japanese fleet appeared north of Pearl Harbor in a perfect battle formation, unable to attack a perfectly executed attack, was a logistical miracle back then. Now, if we go back to 1941, the Americans didn't think it was possible. It's not that the Americans didn't think it, it's that it was incredible for anyone. Also, you have to remember that back then racism was a thing. from both sides, but particularly so from the United States. The United States didn't think that those yellow people could do something like that. I mean, they are, you know what I mean. There was a little bit of that going on, and I would say that there was a little more than a little of that going on. Of course, the inverse was also true. I mean, the Americans could think that Japan couldn't pull that because they were yellows, so to speak. But Japan didn't think that the US would come back from an attack on Pearl Harbor because they were weak. So both sides were racist. I'm saying that, and I'm not going to say anything more. But as for the fact of the attack on itself, everyone says, "Oh, well, it was easy." No, it wasn't easy. It was a huge achievement for the Japanese to do that attack the way it was done. And it wasn't thought as a possible thing or possible scenario because no one would expect the Japanese to expose their navy that way. And they did, and it paid off. So no, sorry, but this argument doesn't hold any water either. And finally, probably the most important part, and the most important point of them all. The US Navy ordered their carriers out of Pearl Harbor to prevent them being attacked by the Japanese. Now, why? Why did the Japanese attack and there were a lot of battleships but no carriers? Well, conspirationists say that, well, as the carrier is the most important ship in the fleet, losing some battleships is not that important, doesn't really matter. Well, the fact is that back in the day, in 1941, the battleship was still the Queen of the Seas. The carrier did establish its position as the leading and most important asset in a fleet during World War II, and especially so during the Pacific battles of 1942. But those didn't have happened yet. So back then, losing most of your battle fleet, most of your battleships, was huge. Much, and it was actually considered worse than losing the carriers. Also, I mean, we can establish a doctrinary discussion here about which was the thought of the time. Did admirals really think the battleship was more important than the carrier, or that the carrier was more important than the battleship? Actually, for the Japanese, the battleship was more important than the carrier, and it was so until 1944. Really, I mean, there's even an instance of carrier being used as a bait to the Americans to be distracted by them, so the battleships could come in and destroy the American fleet. That's Leyte Gulf for you. But I'm not going to enter those kinds of discussions. I'm going to just state a fact that is just easily proven in a discussion. And is that for the Americans, the carrier was as important as the battleship in 1941. All the battle plans of the US Navy contemplated the active use of battleships as the core of their fleet. The carrier was seen as a very strong and important asset, but not the main asset. But the most important part of it is, yeah, the carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor. Where were they? I mean, if you want to keep your carriers out of harm's way, you send them as far east as you can. And if you can even send it to the mainland, all the better, right? The farther they are, the lower the chances for them to be attacked. Now, out of the three carriers the Pacific Fleet had at the time of Pearl Harbor, which were the USS Saratoga, the USS Enterprise, and the USS Lexington. Now, the first one, the Saratoga, is out of the question. It was in San Diego going through repairs to her machinery and wasn't even operational at the time, so it was out. So the Pacific Fleet had two operational carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington. So the conspirationists say those two carriers were hustled out of the port and out of the Japanese way so they couldn't be sunk. Well, that's no, that's not the case. No. The Enterprise actually was within operational range of the Japanese fleet. It was coming back to Pearl Harbor and actually was late to Pearl Harbor. It was intended to enter port in the 6th of December, the day before the attack. It had been in a trip to Wake to unload some Wildcat planes to that island. Later on, those wildcats were a nightmare for the Japanese, by the way. And well, the ship was intended to enter port during the 7th of December, and some of the planes were actually forwarded to the base when the attack was reported. Some dauntlesses were launched from the Enterprise to go and try to assist to the defense of the port. And Enterprise actually entered port on the afternoon of that day. So again, back to the first argument. If you are trying to protect your carriers and get them out of the way, harm's way, so they aren't attacked, what you do is to send them as far east as you can. You don't send them to Wake and then order them back to Pearl Harbor at the same time the attack is going on. Yeah. The second one, USS Lexington was in a trip to Midway, in the very same way that Enterprise had just been in sending fighters to Wake. So, and also was within the operational range of the Japanese. It was just not in the same direction. It was further to the west of the Japanese force. But the Enterprise actually could have been spotted by Japanese planes. It wasn't, which was lucky for the Americans, but they weren't trying to protect those carriers. I mean, those carriers were out of port with very light protection. The Enterprise with half its fighter force, because half of it had just been unloaded at Wake. If you want to protect your carriers, you don't do it that way. You send them off as far as possible, and you don't keep them around. So I'm really, really, really afraid that this doesn't hold water either. So where are the evidences of Pearl Harbor being known by the Americans before it happened? Well, they are nowhere to be found because it wasn't the case. They didn't know it was going to happen. And there are a lot of other little things here and there I could enter here, but this is more than 30 minutes already, and I want to cut it short. But these are the main points, the main arguments brought up by the conspirationists, and none of them holds any water. The Americans didn't know about the Pearl Harbor attack. They didn't know it was feasible. They didn't know it was. They didn't expect it to be feasible. Rather, they weren't expecting it. I mean, they were on alert because it was a chance that a war with Japan was coming. That they did know because the negotiations weren't going really well at all, and they were expecting some Japan moves, and Japan attacking was a distinct possibility. They actually was. But the proof of that is that the Enterprise was unloading fighters on Wake and the Lexington was unloading planes off Midway. They were expecting a Japanese attack, but they didn't expect it at Pearl Harbor, because for them it was unbelievable that such an attack could happen. So yeah, that's it. Myths of Pearl Harbor. It's a very lightweight version. I mean, I could literally speak about this for 5 hours in a row. First, speaking about what led to Pearl Harbor, actually, because we haven't gone in depth about that. We are speaking about the attack, but we haven't explained why it happened. And that also shed some light on why Pearl Harbor was such a surprise for the US. We haven't spoken in depth about the attack itself. I mean, we have spoken about the losses, how it went, more or less, but we haven't spoken about the mid-jet submarines. The Japanese tried to sneak into the harbor. We haven't spoken about the individual acts of courage and individual cases of what actually happened while a ship was struck. I haven't even named the USS Arizona, which is a war memorial where thousands of Americans lost their life. I haven't done so because I want to give an overall perspective on what was Pearl Harbor and why the myths about it being something the Americans knew about was wrong. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it entertaining, and I hope you really had a good time listening to this. As always, guys, thank you very much for watching, and see you later.